All right. Good, good. Ooh, that's good. That has a nice basso profundo to it, doesn't it? Anyway, I could do the Caiaphas part from Jesus Christ Superstar, right? Fools, you have no perception. Anyway, all right, we should get started though. Hello, hello. Oh, Glenn tells me, the Lord be with you. Let us get started. Okay. Glenn's right. It works, right? Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see everybody. This morning, we're moving quickly through the Christian tradition in this theme, but it's mainly to highlight some of the central issues and also some of the central problems that we address in this teaching of Jesus about loving our enemies and not just loving our neighbors, if he's saying, and not just loving our neighbors. But today we turn to the Reformation theologians, so we're several hundred years past Thomas Aquinas. We're looking at John Calvin, and the reading, if you haven't gotten it, is on the stools coming in. But just to recap what we've been looking at so far, there are at least two issues that come up when trying to interpret this command of Jesus. One is when he says, "You have heard it said of old, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." About whom is he speaking? Like, who said that? And we looked at Moses as a likely suspect, because all the other teachings that he says, you have heard it said, if you want to divorce your wife, give her a certificate of divorce. You shall not commit adultery. That's in the Ten Commandments. So when it says, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, it sounds like he's quoting Moses, but Moses never said anything like that. In fact, in Leviticus, Moses explicitly says, you love your neighbor and you have no hatred. You don't bear a grudge. You don't seek vengeance, right? So do not have hatred in your heart toward your neighbor. So it's clear, we looked the first week at that, and on the other hand, the Jewish tradition does not teach love your enemy. So Jesus he's not correctly referring to something Moses taught when he says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So what is he talking about? Who said that? That's one question. And then the second question is, that came up with Thomas Aquinas and with the whole spiritual tradition of the Western Church or the Eastern Church too. And that is this a commandment binding on all people, all baptized Greek people, all disciples? Or is this a counsel of perfection? Like, if you would be perfect, sell your possessions, give to the poor, you'll have treasure in heaven, then come follow me. Or those to whom it is given can be celibate, but not everyone receives that gift. Paul says something very similar, by the way. So that's an even easier one to try to interpret, not as requirement for all disciples, but as a gift given to some. And we looked at Thomas Aquinas last week, and then to give the institutional form of this, the early church very early on has within it ascetics who do sell everything and give to the poor and don't have a home and wander around preaching. And then they also have householders who support them. And you see this especially in Paul's letters. Paul's always thanking women and men who were supportive of his ministry. And these are people with property. They have homes, and the churches would meet in their homes, actually. And so there was always a combination of ascetics and lay people, as we might call ourselves. And eventually they came to separate themselves out, which I think is actually too bad. So the ascetics form monastic communities and other vowed religious life, then friars come later on. And they would view themselves as following these counsels of perfection, right? And so, but they would not expect the baptized to follow these. So they would love their enemies, but the baptized were not expected necessarily to love their enemies. They would sell their possessions. The rest of the baptized were not required to do that, etc. So the question that came up last time with Thomas Aquinas is the command, see, I gave myself away. Is the command, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, binding on all disciples, or is it a counsel of perfection only binding on some? In other words, you have two problems. One is, what's Jesus saying about the Israelite tradition that he's a member of in terms of hate your enemies? And the second is the command to love your enemies binding on all of his followers? And Aquinas thinks it's not, right? He thinks it's equivalent to celibacy and poverty and obedience to an abbot or a bishop or something like that. So he says, for instance, a layperson can observe this counsel in a particular case, even if he or she is not binding him or herself to follow them in every case. And he says, and again, when a person follows not his will as to some deed which he might do lawfully, he follows the counsel in that particular case. For instance, if he do good to his enemies when he's not bound to, right? So clearly, do good to those who do evil to you is not binding, he thinks. Or if he forgive an injury of which he might justly seek to be avenged. So for Aquinas, forgiving others and loving enemies is not binding on everyone. But there may be particular instances where you observe that counsel, but you don't have to. So you would not sin if you didn't. If you hated your enemy, that's fine because you're under the commandments. So those are the two issues. And it sounds like Aquinas actually agrees with the reading of the previous tradition that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy is actually what Moses taught, right? And that's a commandment, and therefore, if your form of life follows that, if you're a baptized person and you don't want to follow the counsels, that's fine, right? But if you want to love your enemies, that's a counsel of perfection. So you can see you actually have a command, you have the appearance of a commandment to allow you righteously to hate your enemies. That's an amazing turn, actually, at this point. So Calvin, yes?
An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth come into the scripture.
That's Moses. That's definitely Moses. And what is done, when you have an ancient society in which there's no justice system at all, right? It's basically clans enforcing their own order as best they can. What an eye for an eye is meant to do is damp down retaliation. Human beings, and studies have shown this throughout any culture, human beings are unique in the living world. There's no other living creature that does this, is we go way over the top in retaliation, right? And I don't need to give any examples. You can just think of it. I mean, personally, right? But she's going to pay for that. Just talk to anyone going through a divorce, right? So we don't just reciprocate proportionately. We retaliate, and we retaliate massively, right? And our rhetoric reflects that too. If you do that, you'll never believe what's going to happen to you, right? Wait till my brother gets a hold of you. That was my thing when I was younger. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is simply proportionality. That if you lose a tooth, the other person loses a tooth, but they don't lose their life, or they don't lose an arm, or they don't lose their property. It's like proportional. So it sounds like it's permission to retaliate. It's actually not. It's commanding you not to disproportionately retaliate because there's no justice system. And by the way, the justice system can be profoundly disproportional, right? I mean, the zero tolerance laws that were passed, the war against drugs laws that were passed that filled prisons with people selling marijuana, really glad they're off the street, right? But anyway, and cocaine, the crack epidemic. So, I mean, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's proportionate either. Calvin once said, since we're looking at him, Calvin once said the greatest crimes are encoded in law. Isn't that interesting? The greatest crimes are encoded in law. Calvin said that. And if you think of World War II and what kind of legislation the Nazis passed, he's absolutely right. I mean, it's really amazing. So I'm only following the law is not a very good excuse, right? So anyway, that's where that eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth comes from, which seems to reinforce this idea that the Israelite and Jewish traditions are vindictive, right? It gives you the sense that Jews following these Moses commandments are mean, hostile people who hate their enemies and want to seek revenge. And that's not what's being spoken there at all. On the other hand, balancing the scales is something every mammal does, right? And so if you violate the norms of a community, the community will call you out and have you adjust your behavior accordingly. There are guppies. My wife told me the story. I just think it's hysterical. There are guppies who police themselves that way. And, the most dangerous thing in any formation, right, is the front line. And so everyone takes turns. Same thing with geese. When you watch our geese migrating, the front goose is doing all the work. Or in speed skating, the lead skater is doing all the work. Now, they can't hang out there forever. When you had those team speed skating, they switched off or else people would punish the person who wasn't switching off. So Anyway, these guppies, guppies aren't exactly high on the scale of intelligence in our mind. These guppies are swimming along in formation, right? And the lead guppies will be out there, and if there's a guppy in the back who's hanging back and never going up to the front, they'll push him or her to the front, right? They'll get behind it and push it up to the front. Say, no, it's your turn. The geese will do the same thing. If there's somebody hanging back at the end of the V and they're not flying up front and cutting the wind, they'll manage to push them up. So every social creature seeks a balance, right? And when things get out of balance, they seek a balance. And Israel is no different than that. And so is our society. I mean, every society does that. So anyway, there's a lot of anti-Jewish stuff that comes out of these contrasts that really is not accurate at all. On the other hand, and it is true, and I mentioned this, the rabbinic tradition has never taught, and the Jewish tradition has never taught, Israelite tradition never taught love your enemies, right? It didn't say hate your enemies, because you should not have hatred in your heart, but it never said love your enemies. So anyway, that sets up a reading for today, because Calvin's aware of both things. On the one hand, who said you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy? So any interpreter of this commandment is going to have to figure that out. And then also, is this a counsel not binding on every baptized person, or is this something Jesus expects of anyone who wants to call him or herself a follower of his? And he even says, so that you may be children of God in heaven. So if you want to be a child of God, it sounds like this is the way you should live your life. It's fascinating to me, because Calvin loves to pick fights with the rabbis, right, and tell them where they're wrong. It's fascinating to me. Calvin is like, who thought of this? Hate your enemies. This is not at all what God taught through Moses, right? It must be the contemporary scribes who were in charge of managing and copying and teaching the law that taught this, and they were injecting their own opinion into this commandment. So if you look at that very first paragraph, really the whole of my presentation today nicely is in one paragraph. So it's he expands on what he means there, but it's really interesting how he interprets it. So he quotes, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor." And this is in his commentary on the Gospels. He says, "It is astonishing that the scribes fell into so great an absurdity as to limit the word neighbor to benevolent persons. In other words, those who love me. I'm supposed to love those who love me." And no one can help that, by the way. I just know that, right? Anyway, so for nothing is more obvious or certain than that God in speaking of our neighbors, not just Jesus now, God in speaking of our neighbors in Leviticus includes the whole human race. See, there's another school of thought that says that the Israelites were to love their neighbors as in their fellow Israelites. But I just heard that Rabbi Jack Paskoff taught at Willow Valley, accurately, that the neighbor includes the stranger, right? It doesn't include the enemy, right? And so this is where Calvin may be pushing it, but it does include the stranger. And so it isn't just fellow Israelites. And there are all sorts of injunctions in the Torah about the treatment of the stranger because, and it says this repeatedly, you were strangers once in Egypt. Right? So you know what it's like to be vulnerable and to be isolated and to be shunned and persecuted because you're a stranger. You are never going to do that. Right? You know better than that. Right? So the neighbor always included the stranger, and it's reinforced explicitly in other places. So, but Calvin takes it further. Speaking of our neighbors includes the whole human race. Every person is devoted to himself, and this is Calvin's anthropology, right? We all love ourselves inordinately. And whenever a regard of to personal convenience occasions an interruption of acts of kindness, in other words, when something gets in my way, there is a departure from that mutual intercourse, which nature itself dictates. So this is not just a command of Jesus. This is not just a command of Moses. This is not just a command of God. This is human nature. This is a law rooted in human nature. It's what they call natural law, right? So every human being does know this. Whether they live this way is another question, but every human being has no excuse not to know this, right? Well, why? He says to keep up the exercise of brotherly love, and this is where brotherly and sisterly love would come in, right? God assures us that all men are our brethren. All people are our family. because they are related to us by a common nature. So everybody's our relative because we all share the same nature. We're all human. Right? There's a study that was done of people who helped the Jews under the Shoah, under the Holocaust, and people went out of their way to like protect the Jews and hide them in their attics and hide them in basements, hide them in barns, etc. At great personal cost, because if they were caught, they would suffer the same punishment. They go in the railroad cars to the camps with the Jews they were hiding, and they wanted to know why would some people do that and most people wouldn't. And interview after interview after interviews, they found out one thing. They said, why did you do it? Because they're human beings. They saw through all the categories we create to separate ourselves from one another and to generate hatred and suspicion and envy and all sorts of things. And they just saw them as another human being in need. If you see another person as a human being, you will do everything you're supposed to do. If you don't, you won't, right? And so that's our problem, is we don't see people as part of our nature, right? But I just think that's fascinating. All men are our brethren because they are related to us by a common nature. And then he says, whenever I see a person, I must of necessity behold myself as in a mirror. So when I see you, I see myself in a mirror, not narcissists, right? There are those of us who do that. We just like to see our own image in a mirror. But he means that what I see in myself, I see in you, right? And actually, I come to know myself by knowing you. I can't really know myself, and he would say this, I can't really know myself without knowing others and without seeing my nature in their nature. For he is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Now, the citation's wrong there. It's not Genesis 29. It's obviously Adam's cry when he sees Eve. And so that statement that leads a man to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife is actually something we all recognize in everyone. Doesn't mean we marry everyone, but that bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, that's what he means. That when you see the other, you see yourself, and you see yourself as one with them. Now, though the greater part of men break off in most instances from this holy society, no kidding, yet their depravity does not violate the order of nature. So this is the way God created us, right? And this is human nature. For we ought to regard God as the author of the union. So the fact that we seek union with each other, the fact that we recognize ourselves in a mirror when we look at another human being and we would do for them what we would want them to do for us, that's the way God created us. That's the way God wants it to be. That's our nature expressing itself. It isn't in other words, if you love your enemy, it's nothing extraordinary. It's what you were created to do. I think that's amazing. Actually, when we get to Bonhoeffer in a couple of weeks, Bonhoeffer thinks this is extraordinary, right? This is something beyond what we're created to be. But Calvin's saying, no, this isn't extraordinary at all. This is what we were created to be. There's nothing that should break off the bond of nature between us. And we think of endless reasons how to do that, right? We're constantly thinking up reasons why we have to cut ourselves off from certain people, never associate with them, stop associating with them. And actually, emotional cutoff now is a huge deal. My wife had two very dear friends of hers for decades cut their relationship off with a text message. Can you imagine? I mean, this is what's going on now, this emotional cutoff, and it's women doing it to other women, which apparently is a thing. Men don't do it quite that way, but women get the razor blade out just if they do that. But I think everybody does that. So God is the author of this union, and therefore, when we don't live that way, we're contradicting our nature. We're contradicting what God created us to be. This isn't just Israel. This isn't just Christians. This isn't just believers. This is any human being, an atheist, a Buddhist. Let's say Calvin didn't know a Buddhist, but anyone. So we see them as one with us. And he says there's a phrase in Isaiah that he quotes, not here, but I think he's thinking of it here, that when we see the other, we see our own flesh. And that's a beautiful statement to me, because our flesh is what makes us incredibly vulnerable. And so when we see another, we see our own vulnerability. And so the image of God, you could say, and he will say that, when you see the other, you see the image of God, and you should love them accordingly. But I also like that you see your flesh, because that's the most vulnerable part of us, you know. And I always think about in the morning, how much do we get ready to show our flesh to the world, right? And if somebody sees our flesh before we're ready, it's an awful thing. You know, our hair looks nasty, and you know, we haven't shampooed or shaved or anything. So that vulnerability is a daily thing, right? And Americans, of course, are now obsessed with odor. So you have to know what chemicals on every part of your body so people don't think you stink. But that's the same thing. No, it's vulnerability. You don't want to have any vulnerability. So put deodorant on every part of your body. And on the ads, they're very clear about which parts you're supposed to use. So yes.
The idea that we're created to love our enemies. Does that assume that we were created to have enemies?
No, it doesn't. It means having enemies is absolutely unnatural. In other words, if you have an enemy, that's a result of human selfishness and human sin, human self-love. And therefore, it's a direct violation of human nature and the law of nature. But it does, no, God would not be, Calvin would not say we're violating the order of nature if we have enemies, if we were created to have enemies. So no, he would say we're created to be one society, right? We're created to be one family.
There were no enemies.
Right.
You're given an ability to do something that wouldn't necessarily be needed.
Yeah, in our original creation, you wouldn't have to be told to love your enemies because you wouldn't have any. Right? So that's the problem. How did we get to a point where our human nature leads us to be one in fellowship with one another, and yet we have enemies? So something clearly broke down. But but it isn't God created us with enemies. No, that would then mean, actually, it would be horrifying. Wouldn't that be horrifying? God created us to be at enmity with others. Like, I think we actually believe that, that we live that way. But Calvin's trying to say, no, it's very, very different. It doesn't mean, by the way, just look around, that's the way people are. He realized that's not the way people are. But he's saying the teaching of Jesus here isn't just Moses. It isn't just God from heaven. It's God's creation is meant to be, we're meant to be one family. Yes, Joe.
Think about neighbors. I think live long enough to have really wonderful neighbors come to live with everything I do.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Because neighbor means someone in proximity to you, right? The next one. And sometimes the next one is wonderful, and sometimes the next one you can understand homicide, right? So it has to stop, right? So that's what, and he knows that we just get on each other's nerves, you know, in all sorts of crazy ways. So the view of what he's saying here is an idealized picture. When I see the other, I see it myself in a mirror. But that takes discipline. We'll see Martin Luther King talk about that in April, because we'll have a little hiatus coming up. But he talks about that as well. And for King, you have to come to know yourself and the dark parts of yourself in order to come to see your neighbor in an empathetic and loving way. Yes?
That's what he said. We are created with instincts for the good and an evil instinct. And that part is not something that we can change. That's part of who we are, our flesh. And at some point does God know that? And so God has given us the law and covenant and prophets because God knows that we have this, but it's not our fault unless you take Augustine's law as explanatory.
Right. Yeah, no, so Calvin, the Israelite tradition and the Jewish tradition think that the evil spirit and the good spirit are part of what it means to be a human being, right? Calvin does not. So Calvin believes that we were created this way, and then due to the sin of Adam, death entered the world, and all of this stuff erupted from that. And so he would say that we were not created this way. We're not created to even be tempted to be at enmity. And so, yeah, it's a really good question. And that's a Western Christian view. The view of Origen and the Greek Orthodox Church sounds much more like the rabbis, that everybody has a good and an evil impulse, and God's commandments and Jesus' life and example are meant to reinforce the good impulse in us and suppress the evil impulse, but we're never going to get rid of that evil impulse. So, And Calvin would say clearly, even the sanctified Christian, baptized and following the teaching of Jesus, will, but due to the sin of Adam, still have all of these desires that war against what they should do. And so you constantly have to behave in such a way that doesn't reinforce the sinful side of things. And so loving your enemies is followed by pray for them, do good to them, bless them, etc. So there are more practices than just love to reinforce the direction in which your life is to go, right? And so if we just focus on love your enemies and don't look at bless them, pray for them, do good to them, I think we're missing what Jesus is trying to get at. So assuming that Jesus thinks we have this evil impulse, which I don't doubt, then all of these behaviors are meant to reinforce the proper disposition, which is to love the enemy as well as the neighbor. And Calvin would say that's the way we recruit. That he's simply citing what it means to be a human being. Did you have a
natural instinct to dehumanize?
No, it's completely unnatural.
If there's good and evil, I think that's how you survive. To dehumanize the person.
Well, that may be one form of survival, but we'll see, especially when we get to Howard Thurman, that's a way to kill your soul. So you may survive, but you lose your soul, right?
Yeah, that's been happening since the...
Oh, well, that's been happening from the dawn of time, but...
So what do you do about the dehumanization? How can you manage
this? When you see the other person, you see yourself in a mirror. Or when you see the other person, you see bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. You see that God is the author of union and is not the author of dehumanization. I mean, dehumanization is how we prepare ourselves to mistreat people and actually to kill them. I mean, military training of any country includes dehumanizing the enemy, so you're willing to kill them. You know why? Because you can't look people in the eye and keep killing them. I mean, the Nazis went with the gas chambers because their soldiers would line Jews up over open graves and shoot them. And after a while, they had mental breakdowns. They couldn't do it anymore. So they had to industrialize it, right? And they had to do it behind closed doors in showers because the soldiers couldn't keep pulling the trigger. That's what he's talking about. If you look people in the eye and you're told to kill them, it's really hard to do that unless you dehumanize them. And even if you dehumanize them, which the Nazis clearly did with the Jews, it doesn't work because you still see a human being in front of you. So what he's trying to say is, pay attention to that, reinforce that, and when you see your enemy, see yourself as in a mirror, including the mess that you know yourself to be. This is King's point. It's really good. I wish Calvin had said that, but so anyway, he thinks that the scribes have therefore misread the commandment of Moses in their own contemporary interpretation. So he's talking about people giving an interpretation in his own day by going with the way people behave and saying that's what God required, right? I love those who love me. I hate those who don't. And that must be what that commandment meant. And Calvin's saying, no, that is absolutely not what that commandment meant. But the commandment didn't mean hate your enemies. It meant love your enemy because that's the way we were created. So he says in the latter part of that paragraph, hence we conclude that the precept of the law by which we are commanded to love our neighbor is general. In other words, includes everyone, doesn't exclude the enemy. But the scribes judging of neighborhood, and this is what we were just talking about with the neighbors who drive us crazy, right? Judging of neighborhood from the disposition of the individual, affirmed that no man ought to be reckoned a neighbor unless he were worthy of esteem on account of his own excellencies, or at least unless he acted the part of a friend. Right? Well, this is incredibly common, right? This is no doubt supported by the common opinion. This is sort of prudential thinking about what you said about dehumanizing others so that we can preserve ourselves. This is just the way it is, right? This is that common sense prudence. And so the scribes are simply teaching what everybody thinks, right? Calvin thinks. And therefore the children of the world are not ashamed to acknowledge their resentments when they have any reason to assign them. Have you ever had somebody ventilate their resentments on you? Oh my God. And that's what we love to do. In fact, we think it gives us status. Oh, you think you've been screwed over? Let me tell you, right? So, or, the worst is, of course, when a relationship falls apart. And then each party goes off to their friends and rehashes all the things that they can resent about the other person and get the other people to do what? Resent the person you resent. So it's like a contagion, right? And so we're not even ashamed of doing that. This should just make us fall over in deep, profound shame, according to Calvin, because it's so inhuman. But we do it all the time. So he's aware that what people commonly think is what what he thinks the scribe said. Love your friends, hate your enemies, and resent them, and bear grudges, and narrate the horrible, sorry tale of all the wrong they did to you to get sympathy from others and status. I mean, in our culture now, if you're a victim, you have status. If you've been traumatized, you have status. And it's a paradox, isn't it? So what happens when you don't want to be a victim anymore? Right? You're out of luck. Let's say you get your life back together and you start to assume some sort of personal power. Well, now you're a dangerous person, right? Now you might be patriarchal or something. Anyway, so the resentment, this is a real issue in our own day, I think, this resentment for being mistreated. But the charity which God requires in his law, so this is Moses, and this is actually natural law, looks not at what a person has deserved, but extends itself to the unworthy, the wicked, and the ungrateful. Right? So when God says, love your neighbor as yourself, Calvin says, love the unworthy, love the ungrateful, love the wicked, because you're fellow human beings. Right? And so they're your neighbor, and you're to love them. It's really quite remarkable. He's one of the only people who says this, actually. So he not only counters Aquinas by saying, no, it's a commandment of Jesus. He counters those who said that the Jews taught this. They, no, this is a commandment of Moses. And then he counters the people who say it's only a commandment of Moses. Say, no, this is human nature. Any idiot knows this. Pardon me, he wouldn't say any idiot, but any human being knows this. They don't have to be taught this by another person. And we see this actually, just to jump ahead to the next page, just to see that. He says, and we'll go back then, but in verse 45, right at the top of page 2, Calvin's quoting Jesus, that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven. I mean, think about that. If you want to be children of God, love your enemies. And if you don't love your enemies, then you're not a child of God. When he expressly declares that no man will be a child of God unless he loves those who hate him, I mean, that's worth thinking about. No one will be a child of God unless that one loves those who hate them. Who shall dare to say that we are not bound to observe this doctrine? In other words, Aquinas, right? The statement amounts to this: whoever shall wish to be accounted a Christian, let him love his enemies. So this would be a distinguishing mark of being a Christian. This was perceived not only by heathen philosophers. So these are not Christians or Jews. These are heathen philosophers. These are non-believing philosophers. But by some wicked despisers of godliness. So the people who hate piety saw this. Isn't that amazing? Who have made this open confession that in nothing do people resemble God more than in doing good. And that actually is true. There are heathen philosophers who say that, and there are people who hate religion who say that. Why do they hate religion? Because they don't see this. Right? They see people hating each other. And it's like, well, you get rid of religion because people don't resemble God in any way more than doing good to others, especially those who don't do good to them. Right? And so you'll see this in non-Christian, non-Israelite literature. And Calvin's like, so this doesn't need to be taught us by God. Or everyone is taught this by God. This doesn't need to be taught us by special revelation. This is something every human being knows. And it's really true. In the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment critics of Christianity harped on this over and over and over again. That Gotthold Lessing wrote this great series of writings on this. And one was the author of the Gospel of John, late in life, wrote this very important part of the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And theological arguments for centuries have fought over the interpretation of those words and excommunicated people, executed people, all that stuff. And Lessing says, tells the story that at the end of his life, the author of the Gospel of John just said one sentence over and over and over again. Beloved, love one another. And they're like, this is really boring. Right? Beloved, love one another. And it's because he saw, Lessing thought, he saw the fruit of all the division based on doctrine, based on the opening chapter of John, and went to John 12, where Jesus commands his disciples to love one another, right? And that's the fruit that religion is supposed to bear, and yet that's the fruit that religion doesn't bear. So Calvin's actually, Lessing is after Calvin, obviously, but Lessing would be an example of what Calvin's saying, that Lessing is just pulling this out saying, isn't this self-evidently true? That if you saw a community that actually loved one another, especially those who hate them, that would be utterly miraculous and transformative. And where in the world did that come from? Yeah, Gay and then Susan.
How do you love?
Mm-hmm.
How do we have justice amidst violence towards one another? What is it to love?
Mm-hmm.
Actually love. We're not talking about standing over here saying,
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of a fight of life.
Mm-hmm.
We hear in the news already that somebody was shot. It's violence around. How, what the question is for us, and I think we just trying to say this in the book tonight. He said, who is the neighbor?
Right.
And as opposed to what the goodness else.
Right, exactly. No, and this goes to the point about the cranky neighbor, right? Yeah.
Not on the end of the I'm sure someone is just but not to just say it. Someone stopped them, and that's why you had the Nuremberg trial. Because the question is, how do we show justice differently than the enemy we have just conquered, if you want to say that way? And I don't really see the argument, but I think loving our enemies as a threat to circumstances, I'm not sure. Christians can practice that.
Oh, I'm not. Well, that's why we're doing this. No, Christians don't. Non-Anabaptist Christians never, in my experience, think about this. Never. And I'll give you an example. The bidding prayers of the church, right? There's only one group of people Jesus commands us to pray for. One group, our enemies. He commands us to pray for our enemies. We never really pray for our enemies, not just abstract enemies, not our country's enemies. I don't know any of them, right? I mean, so I might be taught to hate them, but that's a different thing. I mean, my enemies, right? People who have wronged me, people who have sought to destroy my life and my career. And there are people like that, and I can name them, right? And I'm to love them, and I'm to pray for them. Do we ever do that? No. Do we know that we're supposed to do that? No. Why? Who would do that? I mean, we won't come to church if that's what we're being asked to do. Serious? I'm dead serious. If we held up Jesus's idea of discipleship before Christians every Sunday, the churches would get emptier and emptier and emptier because people would be like, I didn't sign up for that. I didn't sign up to suffer because I believe in Jesus. I didn't sign up to lose my possessions and never ask for them back. I didn't sign up to turn the other cheek when somebody smacks me on the one cheek. I didn't sign up to give my shirt when somebody steals my coat. Well, that's all stuff he said, right? And it's all one thing. So yeah, part of the problem is we don't hear about this. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't raise issues, but one of the ways around one of the problems we have, especially in the Valentine's Day era, is we think this is like romantic love. Love your, this is impossible. It's impossible to love somebody trying to kill you, right? It's impossible to love somebody who hates you that way. You're not going to fall in love with your enemy. So how do you do it? Well, you start with the other verbs that follow that. You pray for them. You do good for them. You bless them. And no, this is something I'm not trying to, yes.
One of the things I had to learn was there was someone in my life, and I mean, who I had every reason on any level to think. And I did.
Mm-hmm.
What I discovered was, when I pursued my own healing with God, I suddenly was surprised by the fact that one day I realized I had. So I'm wondering if practicalities, why it's in the prayers of the people, is to bring us into the presence of God. How can we do something we can do?
Oh, yeah. No, that's very good.
That is
Yeah,
by forgiveness.
right.
It took several years.
Oh, yeah.
But
No, it does come. No, thank you for that. That's exactly what I was going to bring up is the one practice I found in my own life and that other people found in their own experience is what Gay just said too. If you pray, just start with praying for them. Like say the name of the person when you pray. Maybe that's all you can do. Maybe you can't bless them. Maybe you can't do good for them. Maybe you're just not there yet, but just say their name. And then eventually, and also remember, forgive one another as we forgive those who sin against us. Another thing you never hear reinforced. There's only one verse in the Lord's Prayer Jesus reinforced at the end of it in Matthew's gospel. And it wasn't, where's heaven? It wasn't, what's the name of God? It wasn't, all these other things. Where are the angels and all this stuff? It was, for I tell you, if you do not forgive those who sin against you, God will not forgive you. If you forgive those who sin against you, God will forgive you. Right? So the forgiveness of sin is directly related to this. Because if you can't forgive, you can't pray for your enemy, you can't love your enemy, you can't bless those who persecute you. You have to learn how to forgive, which we're commanded to do in the Lord's Prayer, and we don't think about that either. I mean, in other words, if you're not forgiving somebody, God's not going to forgive. Jesus is saying God doesn't forgive you. And if you have forgiven somebody and God forgives you, and then you won't forgive the next person, there's a long parable in the Gospel of Matthew about that. God will not forgive you and will hold you to account for everything, all the sin you've committed, right? And you won't get out till you pay the last penny, he says, right? So everything's in our hand. Our relationship to God, if we want God to forgive us, we have to forgive those who sin against us. So that I know from my own experience, that verse just trips off our tongue like we're not saying anything, and yet we're binding ourselves, that we're committing ourselves only to be forgiven by God to the degree to which we forgive others. So this is all a package: resentment, bearing a grudge, bearing hostility in our hearts toward others, etc. It's all part of the deal. And everything Jesus tells us to do is meant to unwind that. It's meant to unwind this toxic chain we've created around us. And so praying for, don't just start with love your enemies, because that's really hard if you think about it in terms of the way most of us think about love. You're not going to change your attitude toward them. In other words, like, oh, now I love you. That's not what Calvin's saying either. But you are going to see yourself as a fellow human being, right? But then pray for them and forgive them and bless them. There's a funny thing, I didn't get to it. There's a funny thing that's happened in our liturgy, and I'm not trying to pick on anyone, but it just gets under me. In the final benediction, may the Lord bless those and all those whom you love. That's Christianity today, and it's been Christianity for a long time. So we want God to bless those we love. That's exactly not what Jesus is saying here. Exactly not. We want to bless those who are trying to persecute and destroy us, because that's what Jesus thinks people are going to do. They're going to hate you because you follow me. That's what he tells them, right? They're going to hate you because you love me. And those are the people you're to bless. Those are the people you're to pray for. Those are the people you're to do good for. Those are the people whom you're to love, right? That's Christianity as Jesus sees it. And we don't really like that. We want God to bless us and those we love, right? And so and Calvin's saying that's actually not even natural. That's a violation of our human nature. Susan, you had a question though before we move to other hands.
Can't get a grip on the positive and negative in ourselves.
Right.
And me saying, okay, this is the way I am, doesn't cut it in that old movie cartoon, Roger Rabbit.
Yeah.
can't help it. This is the way
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think their prayer, I think for me, my prayer is constantly bring out the goodness and, stifle the other, but also, a treasure minister that I had would say in sermons, be glad you don't get what you deserve.
Mhm.
And I think that we fall on hard times and think, because I do. And, it's all these little things that you're talking about, seems like.
Yeah, no, and we'll get to this at the end of April. The last reading we do actually is a sermon by Martin Luther King Jr. in Detroit on love your enemies. And just a point ahead, because it's come up and it's really good that it's come up. He points out a passage in the gospel of, in the letters of Paul, Romans 7. The good that I would do is what I do not do, and the evil that I would not do is what I do. And and Calvin would agree, that's the way we are. Now, whether it was because of Adam or because that's the way we are, it doesn't matter, right? We're all divided that way. And what we need to do is stop saying, well, I'm only human, right? Calvin would say, you're not human. That division is the violation of your humanity, right? So get over it and quit saying I'm only human and use that as an excuse and start doing what you ought to do and not doing what you ought not to do. That's why we have the confession every Sunday, right? If not even more frequently. So yeah, thank you for that, because that phrase, well, of course I did that. I'm only human. It's like, no, the degree to which you do that reveals that you're less than human. You need healing, right? We all need that healing. And it's because we're divided in ourselves. So I think it's fascinating. The King actually points to Paul, and then there are other authors who point to the same division. He points to Paul and saying, if we had a grip of our own internal battles, we would realize it would be much easier to love our enemies, because they're more complicated than just what we're seeing, right? So if we have evil in us while we're projecting good, when somebody projects evil at us, there's good there, right? So don't forget, you're divided, they're divided. And so give them, recognize that in a mirror, if you will, in terms of the Calvin statement. So thank you for that, though. It's something we tend to forget, right? And I remember once a friend of my wife's was talking with my wife and me, and I was talking about how I could just be a total, I don't remember what the term was, but it's not, a very stubborn, kind of unpleasant person. And I said, that's just the way I am. And she goes, no, now you know what you need to work on. I mean, she was absolutely right. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I did. From that time on, it's like, no, I've really got to, because it was getting in the way of my relationship with my wife and my son and everything. And it's like, oh, that's the way I am. That's my personality. It's like, well, then work on it. It's not enough to say that's the way I am. Yes, behind you. Yes.
I found that you don't have to feel good about saying their name. It takes a while for us to kind of let go of that. And it's actually part of healing ourselves.
Yeah.
Of what we're doing in our own minds and hearts, someone else. That number one, you don't feel like saying their name. And after a while, it doesn't seem to really matter.
Right.
Forgiving yourself, forgiving yourself
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I remember a story, one of my graduate students when I was at Notre Dame told me that her father was brutally shot to death by this police officer in a drug raid. And she worked for years trying to forgive the officer who shot him, because it ruined their life, right? You can imagine just how awful that was. And she finally did. And then she realized now she has to forgive her father, because what was he doing selling drugs in the first place? Right? So when you get rid of the thing that's really drawing your attention, you suddenly learn, no, the deeper issue was she was really angry with her father for getting into the circumstance in which he'd be shot in the first place. And so she said, I'm still working on that one. But yeah, so that's another thing. I think Calvin's very aware of this, that our resentments are often based in something we don't like in ourselves that we then put on somebody else. And then if we hate that, then we're okay, right? Well, I hate, I see this in myself. I don't like it, but I see it even more in you. So I hate you. And that makes me a better person now. Like, no, it doesn't. It means you're just hiding yourself from yourself, right? And so when you start to say the person's name in prayer, And that's what has worked for me in terms of forgiving people and loving people that I otherwise wouldn't. When you do that, you start to unmask all sorts of things that are going on. And I just love, I mean, so honest of her to say, I realized, I forgave him. And she went to the officer and personally forgave him. It was very moving. And then when she stood there like, oh no, now I've got to forgive my dad and he's dead. So how do I do that? And so, but that's one of the things that happens is there's this kind of cascading. I mean, you can imagine there's a lot of damage that we do to one another. And the healing of that damage takes a long time. And so it's not an automatic thing. And I think that's why remembering pray, bless, do good, and not just focusing on the love is really important, because I don't think it's and forgive. I don't think it's an accident Jesus puts all those verbs in there. And we tend to get stuck on the love and how hard that is, which it is. And Calvin says in the last quote of the reading that this is impossible for us to love our enemies, even though it's the way we're created. But do other things then, work at it from different angles, and it does start to heal, and you start to learn how much damage has been done in us because of what's happened in this relationship or in these relationships. So thank you, that's really beautiful. Yes. And I know we're really late, so if you wanted to go to 10:30, which I plan to do, you can hide behind me and we'll sneak in, but yes, go ahead.
God, and what I had to do was change that and say, love is God. And so when I see people loving, and when I spend time in the morning getting in touch with what that love is to me and what's possible to do with it, it just changed. That we are representatives of God, and that our nature is God.
No, it is. And that's what by pointing out all this stuff about this is the way we were created, that's what he wants us to do, is we have to get access to that again. Because otherwise we look at the worthiness of people, or if they're wicked or not, or if they're grateful or not, and then we make adjustments accordingly. So no, it's very beautiful thought. Well, thank you all. Next week, we look at just this incredible example of loving your enemy from the Anabaptist tradition, from the Martyr's Mirror. So Dirk Willems is his name. So we'll look at that next week. Thank you, Mel. Thank you.